My name is Odalis Reinholdt. I'm 33 years old, and 5 weeks ago, at my brother's promotion dinner, my father raised his glass and told the 20 people at the table that Kyle had actually built something real with his life, unlike me, still wasting time on paintings nobody's ever going to pay for. 4 days earlier, a private collector in Chicago had paid $85,000 for a single canvas I'd finished 6 months earlier, a fact my father wouldn't learn until a friend of his happened to mention seeing my name in an art trade publication 2 weeks later. I didn't correct him at that dinner. I raised my glass along with everyone else, congratulated Kyle sincerely, and let the comment settle into the room the way it always had. I already knew what was sitting, unopened, in an email from my gallery representative on my phone. To understand why that comment didn't land the way it used to, you need to go back 12 years, to the week I told my family I wasn't going to finish my accounting degree, and chose, instead, a path none of them ever fully forgave me for choosing. Before I get into it, if you're new here, take a second to subscribe to The Quiet Reckoning. It genuinely helps this channel grow. Drop the word unseen in the comments if your family's ever dismissed something you loved as a waste of time, right up until the moment they couldn't anymore. I read every comment. Now let me take you back to where this actually started, because you need the full picture before any of what happened at that dinner makes sense. I grew up in a family that measured success in fairly narrow, conventional terms. My father, Gerald, spent 35 years as a civil engineer, methodical and precise in everything he did. The kind of man who kept his tools organized by size in the garage and balanced his checkbook to the penny every month without fail. He raised both his children, I think, expecting a similar kind of measurable, credentialed achievement from us, the belief that a good life followed a specific, recognizable shape, a degree, a stable career, promotions you could point to on an org chart. My brother Kyle, 3 years younger than me, followed that expectation almost perfectly, earning an engineering degree himself before moving into corporate project management, a career trajectory my father could track, understand, and celebrate at every step, promotion by promotion, raise by raise, each milestone slotting neatly into a framework my father already understood intuitively. I started painting seriously in college, almost by accident, taking an elective studio art course to fill a schedule gap during my second year of an accounting program I'd chosen mostly because it seemed practical, rather than because it interested me. I remember the specific afternoon something shifted, mixing color for the first time with real intention, watching a canvas become something I hadn't fully planned, feeling a kind of absorbed focus I'd never experienced balancing a ledger. Something in that first painting class cracked open a part of myself I hadn't known was sealed shut. I switched my major halfway through my junior year, a decision that triggered the first serious rupture in my relationship with my father, who sat me down at our kitchen table and asked plainly how exactly I plan to support myself doing something that isn't a real career. I want to be honest that I didn't have a confident answer for him that day, or for years afterward, honestly. I worked a series of unglamorous jobs after graduating, waiting tables, a stint at an art supply store, freelance graphic design work that paid the bills while I built my actual painting practice in the evenings and on weekends, slowly, without any guarantee it would ever amount to anything beyond a deeply held personal passion. I remember one particularly difficult year, about 6 years ago, when a late rent payment forced me to sell my car and start biking to my restaurant job, a stretch of genuine financial precarity that I never fully described to my family, partly out of pride, and partly because I knew exactly what kind of response describing it honestly would invite. My father's skepticism never fully softened during those early years, and I understood, in a resigned sort of way, why it hadn't, from where he stood, watching his daughter choose an unstable, unpredictable path over the steady, credentialed career he'd modeled his own life around. My choice looked less like courage and more like a prolonged, expensive delay of growing up. The comments accumulated steadily over those 12 years, woven into the ordinary fabric of family gatherings so consistently that I sometimes barely registered them as comments at all, just background noise I'd learned to let pass through me. "Still doing the painting thing?" my father would ask at Thanksgiving, in a tone that made clear he considered it a phase rather than a vocation, the question itself carrying an implicit expectation that the answer would eventually change. Kyle, to his credit, was rarely unkind about it directly, though I think he absorbed some version of our father's framing regardless, occasionally offering, with genuine but slightly condescending helpfulness, to keep an eye out for stable job openings in project coordination that might suit my organizational skills, as though my actual career simply hadn't occurred to him as a real possibility worth taking seriously on its own terms. My mother, caught between us in the particular way mothers sometimes are, would occasionally offer quiet, private encouragement, telling me she admired my dedication, though she rarely contradicted my father directly at the dinner table, a pattern of gentle private support and public silence that I'd long since learned not to expect more from. I built my painting career slowly, the unglamorous way most working artists do, group shows in small regional galleries, a growing but modest collector base, eventually representation from a mid-sized gallery in Chicago run by a woman named Priscilla Adeyemi, who discovered my work at a regional art fair 4 years ago and believed in it with a conviction that occasionally exceeded my own. I remember our first meeting clearly, Priscilla standing in front of one of my early landscape pieces for nearly 10 minutes before introducing herself, telling me later that she rarely found work that stopped her that completely at a regional fair. My income remained genuinely unpredictable for years, some months comfortable, others requiring me to pick up freelance design work to cover rent, a financial reality that gave my father's skepticism a certain surface-level validity, even as I quietly, privately, believed the work itself mattered regardless of what it paid. Something shifted, gradually, over the past 2 years, in ways my family never fully registered because I'd stopped discussing the specifics of my career with them in any real detail, tired of comments that consistently undercut whatever small progress I mentioned. My gallery placed several of my larger canvases into significant regional shows. A museum curator in Minneapolis included one of my pieces in a group exhibition focused on emerging American landscape painters. My prices, modest for years, began climbing steadily as demand for my work grew among a small but genuinely engaged collector base. People who followed my career specifically, who waited for new pieces, who understood something in the work that my own family had never taken the time to look at closely. The painting that sold for $85,000, a large canvas called Threshold, had taken me nearly 4 months to complete, a piece I'd worked on through a particularly difficult stretch after a breakup, pouring something genuinely personal into 6-foot canvas that I hadn't fully expected anyone else to connect with the way collectors ultimately did. Priscilla placed it in a significant regional show in Chicago 4 months ago, and after a competitive bidding process between 2 serious collectors, it sold to a private buyer, a retired executive who'd been following my work for 2 years, for $85,000, the largest single sale of my career by a considerable margin. I found out about the sale on a Tuesday afternoon, a phone call from Priscilla that left me sitting on my studio floor for several minutes afterward, genuinely stunned, turning the number over in my mind, trying to reconcile it with 12 years of scraping together rent money and quietly absorbing comments about wasted potential. Priscilla, who knew some of the family history from years of conversations in her gallery office, actually laughed a little on the phone, gently, saying, "I hope somebody in your family finally has to eat those words." I didn't call my family that day. I want to be honest about why. Some part of me wanted to hold the news privately for a while, uncorrupted by the specific, familiar disappointment I anticipated even good news might somehow attract. A fear that felt irrational, even as I recognized how thoroughly 12 years of conditioning had built it into me. I sat with the news alone that evening, pouring a glass of wine I barely touched, staring at the email confirmation like it might disappear if I looked away. Kyle's promotion dinner happened 4 days after that phone call, a celebration for his advancement to senior project director at his firm, a genuinely significant achievement that I was happy, without complication, to celebrate alongside the rest of the family. 20 people gathered at a private room in a steakhouse downtown, white tablecloths and a small reserved bar in the corner. My father clearly proud, giving a warm, detailed toast about Kyle's dedication, his steady climb through the company over 8 years, the concrete milestones of a career my father had always understood intuitively, each raise, each larger project, each rung of a ladder whose shape my father recognized instantly. Near the end of his toast, gesturing toward Kyle with obvious pride, my father added, without much apparent thought, glancing briefly my way, "This is what building a real career looks like. Some of us in this family took the harder, smarter path. Others," and here he paused, just slightly, in a way that made the room's attention shift toward me, "are still out there wasting time on paintings nobody's ever going to pay for." A few relatives laughed, the uncertain kind of laugh that happens when a toast takes an unexpected turn. My mother glanced at me with the familiar, slightly apologetic expression she'd worn through years of similar comments, never quite willing to contradict my father directly, but clearly uncomfortable with the specific cruelty of the moment. My Aunt Louise, seated beside me, reached over and squeezed my hand under the table, a small, silent gesture of solidarity that meant more to me in that moment than she probably realized. I raised my glass along with everyone else, said something genuine about being proud of Kyle, and let the comment pass, the way I'd let dozens of similar comments pass over 12 years. I didn't correct him that night, and I want to explain why, because I think it matters. I hadn't told anyone in my family yet about the sale, and correcting him in that specific moment would have meant transforming Kyle's celebration into something about me, a trade I wasn't willing to make, regardless of how the comment had stung. I finished dinner, congratulated Kyle warmly and sincerely one more time before leaving, and drove home with Priscilla's news still sitting, private and unspoken, in the email I hadn't yet opened on my phone. A strange, deliberate kind of restraint that felt, at the time, more like dignity than avoidance. What eventually surfaced the full picture wasn't anything I orchestrated. About 2 weeks after that dinner, my father's longtime friend Walter, a man who followed regional arts coverage more closely than most people realize retired engineers do, a habit rooted in his wife's years volunteering at a local museum, mentioned to my father, in an entirely unrelated conversation over coffee, that he'd seen my name in an art trade publication covering the Chicago show, specifically noting the sale price of Threshold as one of the notable transactions of the season. My father called me that evening, his voice carrying a confusion I'd genuinely never heard from him before, a kind of uncertain, careful tone, completely unlike his usual measured, engineer's cadence. "Walter says he saw your name in some kind of art magazine," he said. "Said something about a painting selling for $85,000. That can't be right, can it?" I told him, plainly, that it was right, that the sale had happened 4 days before Kyle's promotion dinner, and that I hadn't mentioned it that night because I hadn't wanted to overshadow Kyle's celebration with my own news. There was a long silence on the line, long enough that I checked to see if the call had dropped. $85,000, he repeated slowly, like he was testing the shape of the number in his mouth. "For one painting." "For one painting," I confirmed. It's not typical for every piece I sell, but it's part of a pattern that's been building for the past 2 years. One you'd know more about if the conversation at family dinners ever got past, still doing the painting thing. I want to be honest that I said that last part with more edge than I usually allowed myself with my father. 12 years of accumulated frustration finally finding a crack to slip through. He was quiet for a long moment, and I could hear him breathing on the other end. The particular quality of silence that happens when someone is genuinely recalculating something rather than simply pausing for effect. "I think I said something at Kyle's dinner," he said slowly, "about wasted time, about paintings nobody would pay for." "You did," I said, 4 days after I found out mine had just sold for $85,000. He didn't have a ready response to that. When he finally spoke again, his voice sounded genuinely different than I'd heard it in years, smaller and more uncertain than the confident, measured tone I'd grown up with. "I think I've spent 12 years assuming the absence of a paycheck I could easily picture meant the absence of real success. I don't think I ever really looked closely enough to notice I might be wrong. I think it was easier to keep believing the old story than to sit with how much I might have gotten wrong about my own daughter." I told him I appreciated him saying that, and that I understood, at least partially, why it had taken this long, that my career had never fit the shape he knew how to measure, and that vagueness had probably made it easier, over the years, to default to skepticism rather than genuine curiosity. He asked, quietly, whether I'd be willing to actually show him some of my work sometime, properly, not the brief, distracted glance he usually gave a canvas propped in the corner of a family gathering, but an actual visit to see what I'd built. 5 weeks have passed since that phone call. My father has, in the time since, actually asked to see my work properly for the first time in years, not a polite glance at a painting propped against my studio wall, but a genuine visit to my studio, where he spent nearly 2 hours looking carefully at finished pieces and works in progress, asking real questions about technique and process that suggested actual curiosity rather than obligation. He stood in front of Threshold's companion piece, a smaller canvas I'd kept for myself, for almost 10 minutes without saying anything. And when he finally spoke, he asked, quietly, what had been going through my mind while I painted it. A question that surprised me more than almost anything else that had happened in the previous 5 weeks. I explained the difficult period it came from, the breakup, the specific ache I'd tried to work through with color and texture rather than words, and he listened, really listened, in a way I don't think he'd ever listened to me talk about my work before. He didn't fully understand everything I explained, and I didn't expect him to. The language of color theory and composition isn't something a lifetime civil engineer absorbs in a single afternoon. What mattered was the visible effort, the first real attempt in 12 years to look at what I'd actually built, rather than measure it against a career shape he'd never see reflected back. Before he left that day, he asked if he could take a photo of one of my smaller pieces to show Walter. A small, almost sheepish request that told me more about the shift happening in him than any direct apology could have. Kyle called me a few days after learning the full story, a little sheepish, admitting he'd absorbed more of our father's framing over the years than he'd realized until hearing the actual numbers involved. I think I always figured your painting was something you did because the real career hadn't worked out yet, he said. I didn't realize it was the actual plan the whole time, and that it was working. I told him I appreciated him saying that, and that I understood how easy it had been to inherit an assumption rather than examine it directly, especially when the rest of the family reinforced that assumption at every gathering for over a decade. He asked, genuinely curious in a way he hadn't been before, how the gallery representation process actually worked, what a typical sale involved, questions that felt less like polite interest and more like someone actually trying to understand a world he dismissed without ever really looking at it. My mother, in a quieter, more private conversation a few days later, admitted something that stayed with me. "I always believed in what you were doing," she said, "but I think I let your father's voice be the loudest one in the room for too many years, because it was easier than the conflict of contradicting him directly. I regret that more than I can easily say." I told her I understood the position she'd been in, though I didn't pretend the years of quiet complicity hadn't cost me something real either. I think about that promotion dinner sometimes, sitting there with my father's comment settling over the table, while $85,000 of unspoken vindication sat quietly in my phone. I don't feel real anger toward him anymore, even after 12 years of comments like that one. I think he built his entire understanding of what a real career looks like around the specific, credentialed shape his own life had taken, and I think it was genuinely difficult for him to recognize success in a form that didn't match anything he'd learned to measure. I don't think that makes the years of dismissal painless. I just think it makes them a little easier to understand now, on the other side of a phone call that finally cracked something open between us. I've thought, too, about the particular restraint it took to sit through that dinner without saying anything, holding news that could have instantly changed the entire tenor of the room. Part of me still wonders whether I should have simply corrected my father that night, publicly, the way his comment had been made publicly. I've decided, on reflection, that I'm glad I didn't. Kyle's promotion deserved its own uncomplicated celebration, and I think there's something genuinely valuable in the fact that the truth eventually surfaced on its own timeline, through Walter's unrelated mention, rather than through a moment I engineered specifically to prove a point. It feels somehow more solid that way, less like a rebuttal I staged, and more like a fact that simply couldn't stay hidden once it existed. I've also had to sit with a harder question these past 5 weeks, one I don't have a fully comfortable answer to yet. Whether I would have ever told my family about the sale at all, if Walter hadn't happened to mention it to my father first. I'd like to believe I would have, eventually, in my own time. But 12 years of muting my own successes to avoid the specific disappointment of an unimpressed response had become such an ingrained habit that I genuinely can't be certain how long I might have kept it to myself otherwise. That's its own kind of cost, one I'm only now starting to fully recognize and slowly starting to unlearn. If you're watching this, and your family has ever measured your worth by a career shape they could easily understand, dismissing anything unfamiliar as a waste of time, I want you to hear this. Success doesn't need to look like something your family already recognizes to be real. Sometimes the truth of what you've built quietly outpaces the story people tell about you, long before they're ready to notice it's happened. If this story meant something to you, tell me in the comments about something you loved that your family once called a waste of time. And if you want more stories like this one, hit subscribe. New stories go up every week here on The Quiet Reckoning. There's another one waiting for you, about a man whose family called his hobby fixing up old motorcycles a phase for 15 years, 3 weeks before a collector flew in from another state to buy his entire workshop's inventory.